Hello, and welcome to Brandy Bradley Presents Cowgirl Bookworms. This is a podcast for those of us who both read books and wear boots. I wanted to start this podcast, or not this particular episode, but just this podcast in general, because whenever I would talk to my friends about some of the things that I've been writing and publishing and some of the things in my indie world, they always ask me if I'm doing any recordings of it. And I know, I'm aware, fully aware, that maybe one of the reasons why they are telling me that is so they have a really excellent excuse for why they haven't read anything that I've written lately. And I get that. We are busy. That totally makes sense to me. And there have often been times when I found myself in one of those situations where someone has cornered me and asked me if I read their post, if I saw their social media thing, if I saw what they were doing somewhere. And often I find myself saying like, oh God, no, I had no idea. And it's awkward because, you know, I know that I have that look on my face, that wide-eyed, like, did you like what I wrote kind of thing, needing that validation. So I try to be incredibly, like, not needy, but, you know, clearly I'm doing a podcast from my closet right now because I need attention. So we're just going to go with it. But I tell you what, there's a great statement that I've heard over and over again, and it makes me feel better. And it has really helped those people who have not had time to read what I've written deflect a little bit. So what I often hear from people is, oh, I meant to. It's a shame you don't have a podcast so I could listen to it in the car. And because I'm me, and because I took that as a dare, I'm also going through this thing. I think my New Year's resolution was that I'm going to stop trying to read into other people's subtext. So when I heard that, I was like, oh, well, that's what I have to do. I have to do a podcast, and then they can listen to it in the car. So that's how we got here, folks. Like, that's why it's happening. This is where we're at. So I guess the question is, who am I? My name is Brandy Bradley. My novel, Mothers of the Missing Mermaid, is available on Amazon right now. It is a non-violent crime story that came out last April. And I also write short stories. I write essays. I am an indie writer and an indie publisher. My publishing house is called Rumor Mill Press because everyone loves a good story. And I'm also an educator. I host seminars. I host workshops. I dabble in lots of things. And now I can add podcaster to my resume. And if you are interested in many of the things that I am going to be blathering about today, you can always read my blog at brandybradley.com, where I am full of stories. I have stories for days, y'all. But I'm doing this podcast because a lot of the people who I talk to, whether I'm taking advantage of their statements or not, a lot of the people I talk to do tell me that they don't have time to read. Like, that's something that they often say. It's like, I don't have time to read, which is what everybody says, right? My students will tell me the same thing, and I'm going to break it down to you guys just like I do all of my students, is that is a false narrative. That is not true. We do have time to read. In fact, we are required to read lots of things and then also choose to read lots of things on a daily basis, even though we don't think about it as reading. So I'm just going to point that out. I'm sorry. Just hear me out, though. We humans read all the time. So we have to read emails, like that's a given. And then there's often articles, websites trying to find answers to questions. We read comments, we read threads, and we read the words of crazy people on social media who are trying to get our attention. Even TikTok people will read the captions on the TikTok, or at least this is what I know from my students, is they turn the sound off and the captions on because they can't stream content in the middle of class that makes noise. So yes, they are even reading those short videos that they love to consume at a rapid fire. So yes, we are always reading things. So whenever someone tells me that they don't have time to read, what I hear is, I don't have time to read anything I want. And I think that that's what makes a big difference. So readers, like, people who love to read, romanticize reading. I mean, it is like Pinterest board level romanticization because it is now seen as a luxury. People who love books love to take the time to sit down and absorb the words that they have been presented with. Like, they got their chair, they've got their cozy blanket and tea. I think those are optional. But it is very much about having the luxury to take the time to sit down and to read something. I think that's really the root of what they're saying. And if you're a non-reader, if you're someone who does not enjoy the process of reading, then you might come across one of those images of on Pinterest, right? One of those lovely, illustrations of the girl in the chair with the books and the cat. And a non-reader will look at that and say, oh my God, that sounds so boring. That looks boring. And then they tell themselves that they aren't readers. But I think we are. I think most people are readers just in the fact that we love stories. Either it's the words on the page that are telling you the story, or you're watching some woman on TikTok tell you about a true crime story while she puts on her makeup. And the thing that you're showing up for is that story. Now, maybe it's also to learn how that girl makes that sharp wing with her eyeliner, but primarily you're showing up for that story. And I think that's why people love podcasts. I know that's why I love podcasts. I'm there for the narrative because you get all the info that you want and you can still drive to work, fold the laundry, go on a walk, play video games. You can add this little bit of fun, this little voice telling you the story, kind of like kids at bedtime. And you have your little escape for the day. So this is how Hubs lives. Hubs is my husband. I will refer to him as Hubs. I will talk about him a lot because, he is entertaining. So Hubs has a book purchasing problem where he buys books, but he doesn't actually read them. Because he says he doesn't have time to read, just like everybody else. Except he does read. He reads Twitter and many news articles. But he also listens to podcasts while he stays up late playing video games. It's the multitasking that's important. So if that's how people live, if this is how people operate, if this is how we are, then I'm like, okay, great. I'm going to take my stories, the pieces, the essays, the things that I do every week on brandybradley.com and turn them into audio pieces for those who need their content to be a multitask experience. Now, these are my stories. They are true stories for the most part, but in the tradition of Southern storytellers, I just want to be clear that there are things that are hyperbolic and exaggerated for effect. So just keep that in mind. So for most of the stuff that I've been posting on my website for years now, actually, I've used the moniker books and boots. Like that has always been my go-to. That's been my go-to phrase. But I've talked about different things. I've talked about the books. I've talked about the boots, but I don't think I've ever really addressed where this comes from, right? Why it is both books and boots. So the podcast name is not that. The podcast name is Brandy Bradley Presents Cowgirl Bookworms. But the reality is I'm not presenting them as much as I am it. I am the Cowgirl Bookworm. I am a writer and I am a lover of books. And that concept seems like a juxtaposition. It's like two very opposite ends of a spectrum. You have the outdoorsy and then also the indoorsy. And none of these extremes, this whole concept of being you're either one or the other, the dichotomy, like that never really fit me. I am both outdoorsy and indoorsy. In possibly the most useless ways, like never how people really want me to be. Like, I know I don't want to join you on your trail ride, but I will drive my 4-wheel drive truck to the campsite and swap stories over beers. Happy to do that. But no, I don't hike. I do love to fish. But I don't really like 100% live in that world. But I also don't 100% live in the other side of that either. I do like being outside and I like being in the woods and I like to wander around. And I guess it means that I like to do things the way I want to do things, which is kind of like the story of my life. I don't like to be told what to do and I want to be able to just do it my way. And I don't think I'm the only one who's like that. I don't think I'm the only one out there. I think there are lots of you who's Tennessee or Florida or Georgia or Alabama that rootedness comes out when maybe you're putting somebody in your place, or when you hear your favorite song, or when that smell of spring is in the air and you just can't bear to be inside one moment longer. I think there is a cowgirl bookworm in there. Just ready just for those wide open spaces. Go find them. So how did I get this way? Which, I mean, guess what? I've been talking to my therapist about that for years too. But where does it come from? Like, how does it get this way? Well, I was raised by a band of country-ass rodeo people who made money through our family flower shop that also sold items at flea markets. So I was both a rodeo kid and a flea market kid. So just to set the scene, picture it, West Tennessee, mid-90s. And if you were fortunate enough to drive down Highway 412 between Jackson and Dyersburg, you may have driven past a helicopter in someone's front yard that had been painted volunteer orange. Like, you may have seen that. And next to that helicopter was a little side road. And if you followed that road, then you would find a hand-built, family-run, unaffiliated, and uncertified rodeo arena. And that is where my people planted themselves every Sunday afternoon. Now, a little further down on the highway, you would see a tiny white building with Jones Flower Shop on a sign in front. Now, in the 80s, that was a flashing arrow sign, but we eventually classed it up with a hand-painted sign. And this was our base of operations. This was the launch site where me and my mother would leave to go on these jaunts to all of these flea markets that were usually set up at old Walmart buildings and fairgrounds and like just plots of dirt, where we would have to put our tables out and our cloths out and our items out and do it in a way to convince people to give us money. Like that was how I grew up. So this means until the moment that I moved out of my mother's house, I spent every weekend either climbing into, out of, or sitting on the back of a pickup truck. And I gained some skills. I could haggle over the price of a pair of earrings. I watched boys in those brush popper shirts get thrown into the dirt from either a sear or a bull. I could pour a tall boy of Natty Light into a 20-ounce solo cup without a head. And I ate funnel cakes for breakfast and lunch time to time. And while other people might think, what a delightful and adventurous childhood, I was over it pretty quickly. What I wanted, what I longed for, was to be left alone to read my books. So what I would do is I would sneak a book into my travel bag and read it when my mother wasn't looking. So this was my way of rebelling. You know, like everyone around me liked being outside, preferred to be outside than indoors. They wanted to be in the dirt. They wanted to ride things. They wanted to climb things. They wanted to race things. We had four-wheelers and we had horses and we had trampolines and swing sets. We had those things, right? And that was great. And that was wonderful. But you rebel against the thing that you're presented with. And that's what I did. So I love books. I love school. I cleaned my room without being asked. I wore combat boots instead of the lace-up ropers that every other girl I knew had. So when I became an adult, I felt called to kind of merge these worlds because I didn't fit into the other world very well. Like, I got out into like the working force and I was around college educated people like myself, and they had all grown up in these very middle class households where they didn't have to help build the store on a dirt plat on the weekend. And there was a disconnect there. So I was a reporter and I would spend my days observing and writing stories about other people. But the things that everybody wanted to know about, the thing that I dined out on, the thing that kept getting me invited places were my stories about my very messy family. Like, those are the things that got me into a lot of doors, which was really interesting. Mary Carr writes about this as well, that she tried to be a poet for a really long time. And then she realized that the thing that people kept calling her back for were her true stories, her stories from her childhood. So in my 20s, when I was starting to realize I didn't fit into this one world, I didn't really fit into that other world, I just kept asking myself, was there space for both books and boots, for both of those sides of me to exist in a place and to be accepted? So I bought a pair of Justins and I decided to try it out. I loved school so much that I just kept going back. Like, I took my education all the way to the tippy top. And the only thing I knew I wanted to be was a writer. And I went down a lot of different roads. I did get my degree in journalism. I tried to sell advertising for a while. I thought about being a part of a content mill. I've kept many blogs. I tried to do everything except the thing that I know that I'm supposed to do. And that's to tell stories. So it took me a while to get to that point. But once after that long break, after my bachelor's degree, took a very long break, I went back and I got my master's and then I got my PhD. All of these things are in writing. But in the end, when I think back, most of the lessons that have served me best are the ones that I learned on the back of a pickup truck. So it's funny, also thinking back, to be a writer, especially to be an indie writer, to be an indie publisher, is to be a creative entrepreneur, which is a word that I only learned several years ago. And I'm like, yeah, that's what it is. You're a creative entrepreneur, which means you create things and you sell these things. You have to make sure that you are out there and exposed. You need to know things about business. There are all these things that you have to learn that are completely different from the actual thing that you make. But it's both of those things go together, right? And when I go back and I think about this upbringing where it was rodeo people and flea market people and small business owners, looking back at all of that, I'm like, oh my God, I really was surrounded by entrepreneurs. The rodeo arena was really just the whim of a bored old man who had a bunch of bulls and the local boys were willing to pay to ride. These were boys who wanted to compete in the rodeo on a higher level, and they needed a place to practice. And that is not something you get a lot of practice in unless you kind of make it yourself. So people need that, and people in our community needed entertainment. So he filled those needs. I mean, even my mom took one flower arranging course, and my grandfather built her a little shed for her to do that in. Our town didn't have a flower shop at the time, so that business slowly grew to be one that supported 2 households. And she didn't know how to write a 5-year plan. She just made it happen. She just decided she wanted it, and she went after it, saw a need, and filled it. And then my mother took our show on the road. So she sold all of the stuff from our store at these flea markets, at these different places, to people who would never have ever walked through our doors. They would have never even found our town. A lot of people didn't even know our town existed. And so when the flea markets were down and dirty, we pivoted. We sold on bare tables and slash prices, moving that product. And then when we entered a high-end holiday gift show, we used black velvet displays for our hand-beaded bracelets, and we referred to our store as a boutique. So I was going the traditional route for publication, especially for my novel. And it took years of just me agonizing over everything. Whenever I wrote anything, I agonized over wondering whether it was going to be good enough for the people who were going to be assessing it, the judges, right? I mean, I fretted over my first submissions. I fretted over my first workshops, the first letters to agents, and first small publishers. I was just a wreck. I was nervous. I was worried. And I kept realizing that I was going through the series of asking people permission. I needed permission to be a writer. I needed permission to do this thing that I loved. And I'm not saying that there aren't wonderful resources going the traditional route. Immediately, whenever I talk to writers who have gone the traditional route, I'm like, wow, I don't have that because I don't have a publicity department and I don't have those kind of connections. And there are a lot of things I don't have yet, But every time that I knew that I needed to get up, and write my 100th query letter to yet another agent. Or whenever I would go online to find the names of the new agents and find their, their list of the things that they were looking for, or like whenever I would do that research, it would just almost break me, thinking that every time I wrote one of those letters or sent one of those emails that I was just one in a million, and finding a way to stand out amongst the millions of people who were also querying them, who were also reaching out to them from, even a place like Atlanta, where you would think it would have like lots of like connections and options. I was just at a loss. I didn't know how to break in. I didn't know how to get through to these people. And the more that I kept trying to break in, the more it seemed like I was being told that I wasn't allowed to do something. And when I am told I'm not allowed to do something, I get incredibly spiteful. Like, how dare you tell me I'm not allowed to do something? Watch me do this thing. And that's what I ended up having to do. I had lots of support. It's not that I never saw a publication. I did go through a traditional process with smaller pieces, with essays. I got nominated for awards. I had encouraging mentors telling me to stick it out, just keep going. I had introductions with people. I went through the process as much as I could, and I saw lots of successes out of that. But I just felt like I was jumping through someone else's hoops, and it was making me exhausted. I couldn't focus on writing anything new because I was spending all my time trying to get the attention of someone to look at something old. And it was just exhausting, and I was tired. And then I thought about that country-ass upbringing and wondering what happened to me, and when did I become the kind of person who needed permission for something? You can ask anyone who grew up with me. I have never once asked permission for anything in my life. But what I was doing was chasing after the cool kids and trying to get them to like me. I was listening to something recently that life is just high school and you just relive it over and over and over again. And that's what I was doing. I was reliving some type of like old experience of chasing people down and trying to convince them that I was worthy. And I needed to like get past that. And I had to decide that I was worthy, that it was me. I was enough, right? I choose myself kind of thing. So that's why in 2023, I decided to quit John about what I wanted to be and just become the thing I wanted to be. I was going to become something. So I became an indie publisher. And it took all of 10 minutes to get it done. Maybe a little bit longer. I got online and I got my LLC. And I put together a team. I wrote media kits. I built my website. I've gotten really good at Canva. I contacted a friend who does graphic design. I paid taxes. I coordinated events. I teach classes. I just became the thing I wanted to be. And it's not too different from that old man who said to his friend, help me weld these rods into buck and shoots. Or like when my mom said, sure, I'll make your flower basket for church service. Or when I called my editor friend and I said, hey, I am publishing my novel this year. Will you help me get it ready? And she said yes. So I just did it. I became the thing I wanted to be. So now the fear is, can I keep being the thing I want to be? But that's just another way of me just asking permission, right? And I struggle with it. I struggle with this whole concept of like whether I've made the right choice. But since I decided to become my own indie publisher, I have felt incredibly liberated. Because when I decide to do something, I don't need to jump through a bunch of hoops. I just do it. I make it happen. And I'm very proud of that. But if I learned anything from traveling around with my country ass on the road again family, that lesson actually comes from the poet laureate of Cowboys Everywhere, George Strait, in his seminal work, Amarillo by Morning, when he says, I ain't rich, but Lord, I'm free. So sometimes I think that maybe, if I have made a mistake, right? And that if I am the cautionary tale that my college friends tell at reunions about how I just keep trying and it doesn't seem to be working, that perhaps that's when do you give up, right? Like when you give up on the thing that you want to do. And I was asked that, actually. I was asked, and like, so what are you going to do? Are you going to quit, right? Like, are you going to quit? What would be the thing that would finally make you, like, quit this thing, quit this indie publishing thing, quit this writing thing, quit trying kind of thing? And there is no limit. I can't think of one thing that would actually to get me to give it up, get a normal job, stay in my lane, be boring. I don't think the limit exists. But to quote another writer, because I want to quote a lot of things today, to quote the writer Margaret Atwood, she says, "In the end, we all become stories." So if that's the case, my story will be one of my own making. Besides, honestly, there is nothing that cowgirls or bookworms love more than a good story. Thank you for listening. Read books, wear boots. XOXO. B.